Mark Hamm. I'm professor of criminology at Indiana State University. It's probably not a surprise looking at me. Back in the late 60s, I was part of the hippie movement, part of the anti-war movement, and developed some relationships with groups that by today's standards would be defined as terrorists. So this began my early interest in political violence, or hate crime, terrorism, call it what you will. And by when I went to the university and began teaching in this area, it was about the mid-'80s. And around the Haight-Ashbury section, where I used to go for other things, I began to notice cropping up were these shaven-headed, jack-booted young youth walking around with Hitler tattoos. And at this point, they just called themselves the boneheads. They would later become known as the skinheads or neo-Nazi skinheads. And so I was looking to carve out a place in criminology where I could get my teeth into. It had something to do with my own history, my own background, my own personal narrative about growing through this world and understanding this world through the lens of criminology. I turned my focus on skinheads. And so I spent the latter part of the 80s, early part of the 90s, interviewing skinheads, talking to them in prison, talking to them through the mail. But I must say, the biggest research methodology was the telephone, the good old telephone. I was able to get telephone numbers for skinhead leaders, phone them up, and lo and behold, they were willing to talk.
Why do you think they were willing to talk to you?
I think in general they're willing to talk, right? I mean because I think they're kind of at that point. These guys were like born again Christians. Like they were born again into the neo-Nazi belief system, and how a born again Christian wants to tell all they can. A person just fall in love, wants to tell all they can about their lover. I think they wanted to tell all they could about this new belief. And the fact I unabashedly presented myself as a professor, and I think this worked to my advantage. And I think this is a good tip for all criminologists. I learned this from Bill Chambliss a long time ago. Never hide your identity as a professor. Identify yourself and example, use that to your advantage. Because it all of a sudden it raises the bar in your level to understand what's being said to you. So I did use that, and so I interviewed these people in the cloak of academia, and so I collected, I want to say, I think it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 interviews with. They were primarily leaders of skinhead groups. Then I published that book in 1993.
Was that the International Skinhead book? Or was
no,
that
came
before
next.
That?
That came next.
The American
the
Skinhead
American
book.
Skinheads was first. And then I followed that with an edited book on international hate crime threats, and that included interviews and material on skinheads in the United States and Europe.
What did you learn about these skinheads who spoke to you so brazenly?
Well, there's not one takeaway. There are a number of takeaways. Almost to a person, they were damaged.
Interesting. How so?
In some damaged psychologically, damaged through divorce, damaged through brutality in their own families, brutality at the hands of their fathers, neglected, abandoned by their mother. Interestingly, some of them were themselves victims of hate crimes as they were young white kids growing up in racially mixed neighborhoods, and so.
So they were looking for like family identity and protection, perhaps?
Yes, and culture.
Culture.
It's often been said, I'm not the only one to say this, is that the skinhead movement began with skinhead music. And this is accurate. This came out of the Oi movement out of London in the early 70s, sort of preceded the punk movement. But it had a momentum of its own and had its own stable of rock stars, and they became internationally known. Bands, I mean, they're like Screwdriver, No Remorse. And so these bands, by the time they get imported to the United States, they've achieved cult-like status, and they were seen as a true motivator for further recruitment. So belonging and the culture as well.
And it's interesting because today many on the alt-right are talking about white culture. It's okay to be white. Western culture, European civilization.
Yes.
So this need to connect to something that's bigger.
Absolutely. I see a direct parallel between those skinheads of the mid-'80s and the alt-right people of today.
Even though they hide the Nazi symbology a little bit.
Yeah.
Or use more
coded.
Exactly, like, the
more coded terms.
Blood and soil instead of swastikas.
Yeah, but I mean, even the guys back then, it was used blood and soil. That was a code name that they were for one of their bands. So that's been around. The only thing that's changed is this internet. That's that has allowed for greater dissemination of ideas, and it gets down into darker seams of the American culture, and it's spread faster. On the other hand, this may not be all bad. I've often looked at this problem like this, is that in terms of American extremism, you have above ground activists and below ground activists. The above ground activists we all know. They're people like David Duke, and who's a Richard Spencer guy now. The below ground activists are the ones you need to worry about. They're people like McVeigh, right?
The ones that you haven't heard of at all.
The ones they're below ground. They're not going on television. They're not making appearances before the media. And the above ground activists, I've spent little time on. They may be ideologues and may think that they drive the ship, so to speak, but the ones who do the maiming and the murdering are people unheard of. You only hear of them once after the crime has occurred.
Has the demographic changes with Anglo-whites now being 61% of the population and white Anglo-Christians now being a minority of 47%, has that emboldened or helped them mainstream their message a little more, as we see surveys saying 36% of Americans say whites are under attack?
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, in a larger sense, I think the whole contentious debate about immigration has emboldened them, right? And so, and of course, the Trump Make America Great narrative has fed right into that, hasn't it? And
we've seen more of these mega rallies of 100 or more white nationalists in the last couple of years than we've seen in the previous 10 or 20.
Yes.
Well, why is that?
Well, I don't know, but again, I go back to the thing is they're walking on, they're getting their pictures taken, they're speaking out, they're carrying flags and tiki torches across campuses at night. To all intent and purpose, they seem to be above ground activists. It was the guy who was a below ground activist who got behind the wheel of a car and ran that woman over in Charlottesville, wasn't it? Right? It wasn't the upper. So in that sense, I think there may be more. In this, they're largely galvanized and were drawn there through the internet, right, through chat rooms and whatever. That's what has changed, is that the numbers appear to be larger for public gatherings. But let's plan this, right? They plan these public gatherings.
How important has, along with social media, music and a subculture of violence, boot kicking and all that?
Yeah.
How does that play into the skinhead movement and even into today's alt-right?
Well, I can only say that the early skinhead music was, I mean, this preceded mosh pit, right? This was brutal, where kids had. There are two reasons for the shaved head. One was to identify with working class British dock workers. The other was you can't grab a bald head during a fight, right? And so it was a tactical. They were warriors. Now, what has changed, I think there's a kind of a through line from that culture to today, but as all cultures over a 30-year period, right, they're going to transmorgify. They're going to develop new cultures, new subcultures, new technologies, new leaders, right? So I don't know. I guess the more things change, the more they stay the same. There's still great admiration for Hitler. I mean, that hadn't seemed to die away at any, has it?
Although what's interesting, when he's listening to Eli Mosley's interview on Red Ice, talking about, that's not the best branding, and they want to be able to mainstream their message. So overt references to Hitler or to swastikas or the Klan run counter to their ability to mainstream their message that whites are under attack.
Didn't David Duke do the same thing in the early '90s? Remember that, when he got a suit, got a good haircut, went on CNN, right? And so and ran for president. I mean, so we've been here before. We've seen this before.
Well, I would be remiss if I did not talk about some of your other research. You have interviewed extremists of different stripes in prisons, and you're one of the preeminent scholars to be able to do that. What are some of your findings that you've found with regard to these imprisoned extremists across the ideological spectrum?
Well, I think one thing that can be said about a commonality is that these guys I interviewed in prison who did embrace extremist beliefs, they were all searchers, right? In other words, they went into prison uncertain about religion in general, ignorant, really. About
Andrew Anglin started out as a vegan and not a Nazi at all.
Yeah,
he runs the Daily Stormer.
Okay, yeah, these people didn't go to Bible school class, and their parents didn't take them to church. By the time they come to prison, especially if they're facing hard time, 20, 30 years, or they're doing life, they look around. They begin to search for meaning. This doesn't often happen in the first month or even the first year of incarceration. It'll happen down the road. But they begin to look around, and they begin to ask other inmates about religions and philosophies, and they begin to trade books, and they begin to trade underground pamphlets.
So rather than getting remorse, it's kind of like a university of extremism.
That is my point. Yes, that's my point. Is this the way, now, especially with regard to religions, this is how extremist religions are passed from one inmate to the other. The other point I make is that all radicalization is local, right? In other words, I didn't find any evidence of some radical Wahhabi cleric in Saudi Arabia importing vast numbers of the Wahhabi Quran to inmates in the United States. Found no attempt of outside imams or white supremacists coming into prisons and radicalizing inmates. This is all done inmate to inmate, one-on-one proselytizing, usually by a charismatic inmate himself who's looking to build a little power base, looking to find some followers.
What role did the internet play prior to the entry to prison?
Yeah, hard to say, because that's all over the board, right? I mean, you got guys who who went to prison before the internet, and those who were, understood it very well. So it's hard to say, give a definitive answer on that one.
What's the best thing we can do to counter radicalism?
Well, somebody asked me at the United Nations, said, can you give a profile of a typical inmate who is radicalized? I said, no, but I can give you a profile of a typical prison that will radicalize inmates, and that prison is one that is overcrowded, mismanaged, where rehabilitation no longer matters, where inmates are deprived of meaningful work, hard. I'm not talking about breaking rocks, but about meaningful, productive work, a sense of safety, counseling, everything that makes that we read about in our textbooks about good correctional treatment. Those prisons will not produce radicalized inmates. Now, there are prisons that are conversely mismanaged, typically large maximum security prisons. Those are the prisons that will most likely produce inmates with extremist beliefs.
So it sounds like similar to what we see on the outside, where a lack of governance, protection, and meaningful opportunities create a vacuum where extremists and radicals can grow. It sounds like in prison, It's the same thing.
Couldn't say it better.
Well, Dr. Hamm, is there anything that we missed? It's always a pleasure talking to you.
No, I enjoy your enthusiasm, Brian. I think that you do a service by keeping these ideas out there in the forefront, in asking questions that are simple enough for large bodies of people to understand. This area is not really that complicated, you know, and I think it's commendable that you have expressed these things in easily digestible, bite-sized little presentations so that people can better understand these things. So many times we get so lost in theory, postulations, and deep discourses about social movements that we walk away in our heads in a bubble. I think you've cut through a lot of that through your podcast here and through your, especially where I see you most is on television, giving these witty little comments about extremism.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your help when I was testifying before Congress. Lastly, what do you think the trends are for the future?
Oh, I see a continuing growth of the alt-right. I think that's going to.
As an extremism or a mainstream socio-political entity, or both?
Let's get straight. All terrorism ends, right? So in other words, we're back to this issue of above ground and below ground. Let them have as many above ground activists as they want. Let them have their marches. What we are interested in is the below ground activist, the one who uses violence. Now, if that stays in check, then as a society, you've got to ask yourself a real pragmatic question. Is it so bad?
How do we keep it in check?
Well, as long as you don't have another McVeigh around, that's you're doing pretty well, right? If we don't have a series of terrorist attacks or an increase in hate crimes, serious hate crimes, then it's somehow, I mean, not all countries have problems in this area, right? It came back from Denmark, and it is a country with a very low rate of interracial crime, a low rate of terrorism. Why is that? How do societies manage to keep a check on this?
But we are seeing a lot of this above ground throughout Europe. This white nationalism, this Euro nationalism is an international trend.
Well, I don't see any evidence that these acts of terrorism are increasing. For the Muslim, the jihadist threat, yes, indeed, there is indeed an increase. But I think in terms of below ground, that's really where the emphasis needs to lie, is on these Muslim extremism.
All right. Well, Dr. Hamm, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for talking with us today.
All right, Brian.
Thank you.